It all started with the business deal gone sour. And what came out of that was the greatest rivalry in the history of racing. Ford, Ferrari, two titans of the automobile industry, waged war at what was at the time in the 1960s, the biggest race in the world, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. You have to imagine the scene. 250,000 people, television cameras for the first time. People all over the world were watching this one race. It was like a Super Bowl of speed. Definitely the most dangerous sporting event of any kind in the world.
To win Le Mans, it meant that you were the best.
Everybody drove in it. All the Formula One stars at the time drove at Le Mans, alongside all the sports car heroes.
It's the ultimate venue. You win Le Mans, the whole planet knows.
We're starting 55 cars. I don't think more than 15 or 20 are going to finish.
For an automotive manufacturer, it proves their endurance more than any other race can possibly do.
Commercially, it is the most important race to win in the world for a car manufacturer.
From the moment the second automobile was built, racing was born. And the car that would win is the car that people wanted to buy.
It took a lot of cheek to think it could rival the horse as a way of getting around. The car lost the race, but it won all the attention. And none was any too modest in the things he had to say about his own breed of horseless carriage. The best way to settle these competing claims was in a sport which W.K. Vanderbilt brought to America from Europe, a race over public roads. By the third year of the race, 1906, 2 million people turned out to witness this new sport where men and machines were linked as teammates. Racing at 60 miles an hour on the straights, only the fittest cars survived, and those which held up in racing competition redoubled their boasting in advertising.
From there on out, people who built cars knew that they had to win races to market their cars. So racing spread the gospel of automobile companies all over the world.
In Detroit, a man named Henry Ford was making what he called a quadricycle. It looked like a buggy, only it had no shafts for a horse to be harnessed to. The horsepower was going to come from a gasoline engine he'd made himself.
In 1901, Henry Ford was kind of struggling at that point. You know, he would end up starting and then failing twice before he started the Ford Motor Company.
He was an engineer and a technical guy, and he was not one of the wealthy people at the time.
He had this very pivotal race against Alexander Winton.
He had the Crystal Bowl victory winner for this race.
He thought Alexander Winton was the most important race car driver of the day, that maybe if he got some of his engineers and put together a car and raced Winton and beat Winton, that would be the beginning of the new launch of the Ford Motor Company.
He raced a car that he called Sweepstakes, but it was lighter and it was more efficient than Alexander Winton's car. And he was behind Alexander throughout most of the race, and then Alexander's car began to slow, so he eventually caught up and passed him and won the race.
People came to him at the end of the race and said, anything you want to do, Mr. Ford, we're happy to invest.
That's always been something in my mind that is really kind of a key element of our company's DNA, which is that we were really born on the racetrack. In 1923, I think, was the first year that Le Mans was run, and there was a Model T racer, and various private companies had taken Model Ts and adjusted them and used them in racing.
That started the modern-day history of the Ford Motor Company.
Enzo Ferrari was born in northern Italy, 1898, into a mixture of a rural and industrial area. His father was called Alberto, and he was a metal worker.
The family of Ferrari, they had a house in Modena. They were producing parts for the Italian railway.
My father, as a kid, he was not much interested to the family business. He was a dreamer.
In 1908, father took Enzo to a big motor race called the Coppa Acerbo.
He was fascinated by this racing cars, and so he fell in love with motor racing.
And from that day onwards, he wanted to be a racing driver.
The First World War happened, and so, well, no, it was very a tragedy for everybody. It was a tragedy for him. He lost the father, he lost the brother.
Enzo is called into the service. He starts doing motor maintenance for the artillery regiment. Still in the back of his mind, what he really wants to be is a race car driver.
After the war, he did sell the house for buying racing cars. That is the reason for which at the beginning the people from modern days thought he was crazy.
For Alfa Romeo, he did one race called the Coppa Acerbo in 1924, won that, and said that that was the point when his life changed completely. That was when he said he became a real racing driver. At the same time, Alfa Romeo is going through all kinds of financial problems with the parent company. They can't be seen to be directly involved in motor racing in the way that they have been. So they hive off the motorsport side to Enzo. He sets up a new organization called Scuderia Ferrari, which is, in everything but name, is the Alfa Romeo racing team. For the first time, he had premises of his own. He also had a badge of his own, a black prancing horse on a yellow background.
The Prancing Horse is a family story about my father, that he was a young racing driver.
And he won 2 years in a row a race called Circuito del Savio.
And in the crowd was a guy called Count Baracca. His son, Francesco, had been a World War I fighter ace in the Italian Air Force. He had 34 kills before he was killed himself.
The mother of Francesco Baracca told Mr. Ferrari to use the emblem of his son for his car because he was the only man in Italy eligible to use the prancing horse.
And he used the logo in 1929 when he established the Scuderia Ferrari.
While Ferrari is running Alfa's Scuderia Ferrari, they win everything there is worth winning. They win Grand Prix, they win the Targa Florio, and from 1931 to 1934, they win Le Mans 4 times, all on his watch. One thing that goes all the way through Ferrari's life, he was an individual. He did things for him. So when Ferrari eventually negotiates his way out of Alfa Romeo around 1939, he gets quite a good financial payoff. But part of the settlement is that he will not be allowed to build cars using his own name for 4 years. As it turns out, those 4 years will be 4 years of wartime.
During World War II, we had basically converted all of our factories for war production. Tanks and airplanes and jeeps and everything.
It really was Henry Iannezzo's idea to transform Willow Run and build bombers. Henry Iannezzo wanted to help the war effort. They wanted to do whatever they could, to help win the war. Many of the history books would say if the Ford Motor Company hadn't stepped up and built the bombers at Willow Run, we might not have won the war.
The business during the war was producing grinding machine for the army. And this was the mean to survive, to have his employees working even during the war. But at the same time, he was designing cars, and he had engineers that were working for him, designing cars.
Modena is quite heavily bombed during the war.
It's possible that during World War II, Ford and Ferrari had their first run-in. It's highly likely that the bombers that took out Ferrari's factory had come from the factories of Ford Motor Company.
Ferrari needs somewhere a bit quieter.
With the money he got from Alfa Romeo, he bought the ground in Maranello, where he wanted to build the factory for with the purpose to produce cars.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
Immediately after the war, in 1947, the design of the first Ferrari was ready 2 years after the war.
The 125S, it was a 12-cylinder. You have to understand something. Italy was destroyed. Everything was a ruin. And to start producing racing cars under this condition was considered to be crazy.
He was following his dream, his passion for engines and for racing.
The new Ferrari, it's very, very sophisticated. He built very small engines, but very sophisticated engines. And they were purely designed for racing. So it had overhead camshafts, hairpin springs, lots of carburetors. Everything about it was a racing car.
The car, short after his introduction, won the Grand Prix of Rome, Circuito di Caracalla.
He only built two 125s, but those two cars did so much that Ferrari is now a name in his own right. The cars are called Ferrari, and they start winning.
Henry had gotten quite a bit older in the 40s. He can't run Ford Motor Company. Edsel died. So they bring my father, Henry Ford II, out of the Navy.
My grandfather, for as strong of a personality as he had, I think really still created that team atmosphere, and he brought people in and delegated and relied on other people to make important decisions. Henry Ford I was a little bit less democratic about the decision-making process, and he was the end-all be-all of the Ford Motor Company, and he didn't really ask other people for help. It was sort of his way or the highway.
Young Henry Ford, he had no experience, but he had a good sense of what the right thing to do was, so he went out and hired a whole bunch of really smart guys and brought them to Ford Motor Company. And they were finance people, manufacturing people, marketing and sales people. It was really a group of probably the smartest business people of the time, known as the Whiz Kids.
1949 is a really, really big year. It's the year that Le Mans comes back onto the calendar after the war. It's also the first opportunity for Ferrari to enter Le Mans, although he'd been involved with the four Alfa Romeo wins before the war. Ferrari rocks up at Le Mans with two 166 Barchetta cars.
The car was driven by Luigi Chinetti, and Chinetti won the Le Mans 24-hour race with this Ferrari car, and it was a really very impressive win.
First time out for Ferrari, wins the world's biggest motor race. He's spending a lot of money on his racing. Everything Ferrari does, he does the expensive way. He does the sophisticated way.
At this point, Ferrari put everything into his company, and this was something that he would continue to do for the rest of his life. When you think of Ferrari and what Ferrari means, you would think that the founder of that company would be extraordinarily wealthy, but he never was, because every lira was always spent on racing.
The operation's getting to the point where he needs more and more money, so he will then have to sell cars for the road, which is the last thing he wants to do. America is a dream market for European-type sporty cars. Chinetti is Italian-born, lives in America, and he imports cars. So very quickly, America has a Ferrari importer.
Because of that victory and because of Luigi Chinetti, everything started and the business grew up also in the United States.
At this point in their history, Fords and Ferraris were as far apart in the automotive spectrum as could be.
The new four-door custom sedan is a perfect example of the balanced engineering built into every model of the new 1949 line.
There aren't any curvy roads in Detroit. This is the Midwest. Everything is flat and straight. Their whole idea of what a great car was this idea that you get into this living room on wheels and you plug it in and it goes down the road and it's very soft and it isn't a sporting automobile. The whole idea of a sporting automobile that handles well, it didn't resonate there because there was no reason for it.
And out on the highway, the Ford in your future with its lower, safer center of gravity provides a smooth midship ride. Quiet as a whisper and gentle as a summer breeze.
The auto companies really didn't want to compete on innovation. They wanted to compete on advertising and marketing. And to do that, they wanted to compete on things people could see, like styling and horsepower. The competition was fierce over horsepower. In the minds of adults, maybe it wouldn't have led to more reckless driving. But in the minds of youngsters, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, they were technologically stagnant in Detroit on fuel efficiency, on ease of repair, and above all, crashworthiness and better brakes and tires.
Sports fans today, I don't think, could even imagine how violent motorsport was during the 1950s and 1960s. Death was almost routine at racetracks.
The worst ever accident in motor racing was at Le Mans in 1955.
All seems to be going smoothly when disaster strikes at 125 miles an hour. LeVay's Mercedes collides and blows up.
Huge parts of the car went straight through the packed grandstands. Round about 90 people were killed, including the driver.
Back then, I mean, when you got in the car as a driver, I have to imagine you had to be ready to die because it was a strong possibility that you wouldn't survive the race. Unfortunately, I think that's part of what added to the spectacle of Le Mans.
The circuits weren't safe, the cars weren't safe. If you had a big accident, it would burst into flames.
Coming through Terre Rouge at Le Mans, for example, there's a big line of poplar trees. Well, their idea of safety in those days was to paint them white up to about head height so that the headlights would show this white tree, and then they'd lean a straw bale on the first one.
You had drivers driving cars at over 200 miles an hour down the straight, and they're not wearing seatbelts.
Half the drivers did not wear seatbelts because of the danger of fire. You know, they'd rather be able to jump out or be thrown out than risk the fire. I was in 6 fires in 4 years. They caught fire all the time. You know, you didn't have to crash. You're driving on. Boom, 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 boom. Up they go.
Eddie Sachs, Dave McDonald, so many of the great drivers that lost their lives in fires.
Every year, you would expect maybe 1 in 4 drivers to have a huge accident and some of them to die. And it was just accepted.
The owners and the race team people, they were much less concerned. And they just say, hey, if you're a driver, you're in a dangerous business, and that's too bad.
Ferraris were the worst. I mean, safety didn't come into their mind. And if a driver ever mentioned it, you're out in your ear.
Ferrari wasn't doing anything that all the other car companies weren't doing, but they were doing more of it.
My father was always telling me not to become too friendly with the driver because one day they die. The history of those eras is a tragedy.
The Mille Miglia was a road race around Italy. 1957, there were 5 Ferraris. One of them is driven by a guy called Alfonso de Portago. Quite early in the race, he has a tyre blow. He goes into a group of spectators. Portago's killed, his co-driver is killed, around 10 people in the crowd are killed, and 5 of those are children. And that is one of the biggest disasters for Ferrari in racing. The Mille Miglia was immediately banned. In Italian law, if a driver was killed in one of your cars, the manufacturer has to answer to the law. So in this particular case, Ferrari is investigated, facing manslaughter charges. It goes to legal process, and in the end, Ferrari isn't guilty of anything because it was a racing accident.
There was a group called the Automobile Manufacturers of America.
And in 1957, the AMA essentially mandated that automakers could not participate in racing. And my grandfather was the chairman of that committee. And so he obviously took that very seriously. And as a result, he basically pulled all of Ford Motor Company's efforts out of racing.
When Ford did that, they sold off the surplus cars and equipment to my father and one of his race drivers, Ralph Moody. And they bought for $15,000, $16,000 the surplus cars, parts, tools, and it became Holman and Moody.
My father's management style was very tough, very rude, and very direct to the people. But he was always listening to the people, but taking himself his own decision and his way.
In 1961, Ferrari almost threw the whole thing away, and it was about an internal problem that got out of hand. Laura Ferrari, Enzo's wife, was spending more time in the factory working on management. A lot of the high-ranking engineers and other people in the factory didn't like the way she worked.
Carlo Chiti was the technical director. He did ask Ferrari to ask his wife to stay away from the factory.
He told Ferrari that either she went or he went. He went. Several of the most important engineers then wrote a letter to Ferrari backing the guy who'd gone and saying the same thing. He comes back or we go. They went.
All the top management of Ferrari, racing team, and also sales manager, so all of them have been fired in one day from my father.
And he said to all of the Ferrari people in that time, if the colonel are leaving, we will do it with the sergeant.
Un bel giorno mi chiamò Ferrari e siediti, mi disse lì. Dico, vabbè, cosa vuole il commendatore? Disse, dico, io ti voglio dire una cosa, tu da oggi in avanti ti dovrai occupare del reparto corsa. E io lo guardai e disse, ma come tu sei matto? Io ho 26 anni, sono giovane, non ho esperienza. Tu non ti devi preoccupare, mi disse lui. Tu ti devi occupare del tuo lavoro. Io mi occuperò dell'altro e ti starò vicino e tu starai vicino a me. Enzo Ferrari era un uomo indubbiamente non facile, ma era un uomo estremamente intelligente e soprattutto con un enorme feeling delle cose. E io, dopo che lui mi aveva forzato ad accettare la responsabilità del reparto corse, avevo un rapporto con lui estremamente valido.
The big companies in Detroit, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors, they had a gentleman agreement not to put money in racing.
We all agreed we weren't going to be in racing, but there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes.
There were all kinds of maneuvers that they used. They would support third parties who could have deniability. Well, it wasn't GM. They'd use police parts, things like that.
One of the programs that got cut off on this was the GM Corvette. Bill Mitchell said, we're not going to let that happen. This whole anti-racing thing is going to blow over, so let's hide this program and we'll design and build a new Corvette in secret.
These executives had an agreement that they would not spend money on racing, but General Motors was cheating and everybody knew it. This was in the newspapers that they were cheating.
The Corvette was dominating the American sports car racing world.
The Corvettes were winning everything.
People were paying attention to racing in this country. They were noticing who won on Sunday, and there really was a strong correlation to sales on Monday. We didn't have that performance component of our brand that customers wanted.
Ford had the Galaxy, Ford had the Thunderbird. They really had nothing that could compete with the Corvette.
GM had something like 60% market share, and over the course of a year, there had literally been almost a 15-point swing where they stole 15% of market share from Ford.
Henry Ford flipped out and he says, hell with you guys. You know, if you're cheating and you're not going to uphold the ban, I'm announcing right now that I will not, publicly not do it, and we're going racing.
Henry is at a motor race, Sebring, sees a Ferrari win and says, we need those red cars.
My grandfather knew that we wanted to win Le Mans, and Ferrari had won Le Mans and had been winning Le Mans. I think he felt the easiest way to do it was just to buy Ferrari and then merge the companies and use their kind of technical expertise to help win.
Ferrari would bring a commercial sports car that could compete with the Corvette and a racing team with international pedigree.
Ferrari built a few customer cars to pay for his racing, which is interesting in one way because it's the exact opposite of the Ford story. Ford went back into racing to sell customer cars. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Really opposite views.
They made an approach to Ferrari to investigate if he was eventually willing to sell the company. And Ferrari said that he was willing to speak about it, in any case, to see which were the terms for the sale.
There was a lot of effort put into making this deal a reality. The lawyers and the accountants and everybody went over there. They went through, a series of negotiations and kind of hashed out this deal where there would be two kind of companies.
A Ferrari-Ford division with the purpose to take part to races, and a Ford-Ferrari division with the purpose to manufacture cars for road use, Gran Turismo cars.
The Ford team tried to put a valuation on the company, and I think Enzo, in his mind, had a valuation, and they were, I think, at first pretty far apart, and then they ended up settling on $15 million.
We'll try to accommodate your desires. I see. Best we can.
My father thought that this was going to be a done deal. Ford Motor Company was going to walk away with an incredible brand. And then all of a sudden, this racing thing just exploded.
Sticking point was the racing side of the business. That would be called Ferrari Ford. That would be owned by Ferrari, by Enzo. But there was a stipulation in the contract that said Ford would still have veto power or control over what series was raced and where the cars would race, who the drivers would be, etc.
Ferrari said, no, I don't want to sell it.
He didn't want to accept any restriction on motor racing, and his choice was for the freedom.
Ferrari used that gambit to try to sell the program to Fiat because he didn't want the Americans to take over his company.
Gianni Agnelli gli aveva promesso che probabilmente la Fiat sarebbe stata alleata della Ferrari, come in effetti è stato.
Enzo didn't want anybody telling him how to run his racing business in Europe. And my grandfather didn't want anyone telling him how to run the racing business in Europe.
Final moment came, sitting in his rather monastic office in his works in Modena. And he said, I don't want to race at the Indianapolis 500.
He turned Ford down.
My father was extremely disappointed.
That's when he decided, all right, we're going to beat you. And we're going to beat you at your own game in your backyard. After the Ferrari deal fell apart, Ford had to create this car that could beat Ferrari and win Le Mans.
If you're going to compete at Le Mans, you need a car with very high top speed, so you can get down this straight very, very quickly.
My grandfather formed this division of the company called Ford Advanced Vehicles and took the best engineers he could find, and they came up with the original GT40.
They designed everything. They designed a specific magnesium casting with 92 separate parts, all custom fabricated and custom made just for the pedal assembly. The chassis was a unibody, but it's as detailed and complicated a unibody as anything they did for Mustang or any of the production cars. It was a purposely built race car.
It was maybe heavier than it should have been, but it was very nice to drive. It was beautifully finished inside the seats, and the controls are very easy to use.
They were built to race. When you go into a corner in the GT40, it's meant to go around there.
The style of the GT40 was really representing a big change in motor racing. My father was surprised about the car. The design of the bodywork very impressive.
The size and shape of the GT40 made it such a unique vehicle. I'm not sure if people had seen a car that was so low, so it was clearly a very unique and dynamic design.
Ford had invested a lot in making it bulletproof for racing.
The money Ford spent in racing for Le Mans was the biggest amount of money ever in one big wad to get dumped into racing. It just changed the scene for everyone.
Especially in Le Mans. If you want to win from zero, you have to invest more money than the team that have been winning.
We would get anything that we wanted. If it was a sensible choice and there was a need for it, it would help durability or speed or performance, we had no problem getting it.
We felt really good about our chances at Le Mans.
Ferrari had a proven track record. Winning Le Mans year after year, every year the car was better, faster. Mauro Forghieri, the young, new chief engineer at Ferrari, was about to instigate some very radical moves.
La 250p. Quando io andai da Ferrari e dissi, guardi, secondo me, noi dobbiamo usare il nostro 12 cilindri, che è potente, molto elastico, per fare una macchina a motore posteriore.
Mid-rear engine racing cars, both in Formula One and sports cars. That had never happened at Ferrari. It was a radical move to put the engine behind the driver.
Apriti o cielo. Avevo tutta la fabbrica contro. Un motore così pesante dietro non avrebbe potuto fare una macchina competitiva. Io ne parlai con John e John era d'accordo con me, perché gli dissi, John, facciamo questa macchina. Abbiamo fatto pochi giri a Modena solo per vedere che andasse bene e John Surtees ha battuto tutti i record con quella macchina.
Le Mans always had hundreds of thousands of spectators, but this year it was overflowing. Ford's debut at Le Mans drew millions of eyes to that race around the world.
The Le Mans 24-hour race at last, and 3 gleaming Ford GTs are present.
There was a tremendous amount of publicity, the fact that Ford Motor Company was going to enter the Le Mans race with these new GT40s.
This is the Ford, the blue and white Ford bearing the American racing colors, the lowest car by far in the field.
Well, now, do you feel the preparation of the Ford is equal to the preparation of the Ferrari, after which has won for I don't know how many years?
Well, I think the preparation is every bit as equal. The only problem is that this is a new car, and it isn't related to any other car that that's been run before, whereas Ferraris always are usually a development on something else that's already existed.
Two of the great manufacturers from either side of the Atlantic are going to tangle for the first time. The stage is set for a war of speed.
At 4 p.m., the starter drops his flag and runs for safety. But disappointment. Phil Hill's Ford is seriously delayed with fuel vaporization troubles.
In the opening laps, the GT40 is furiously fast. There's a helicopter camera car following it. Its top speed is incredible.
Do you reckon you've got anything up your sleeve that you can sort of pull out a little bit more?
I can pull out 15 seconds anytime you wanted it, but we're trying to finish 24 hours.
You mean they won't let you pull out the 15 seconds?
Ford's first casualty is Richard Atwood from Britain driving a GT40.
Going down the straight, I guess the fuel line came loose, and I could see through the rear view mirror and the glass partition between the engine bay and the passenger side, the flames coming up. And suddenly there was a woof underneath the bonnet, and I stepped away from it. And it's a sad sight, but that was the end of our race.
The third car, which Phil Hill and Bruce McLaren are sharing, it's the fastest car on the field.
During the 11th hour of the race, troubles brew for Ford. Richie Ginther's GT40 is retired. 13 hours into the race, Phil Hill's GT40 goes also.
The cars really weren't ready to run 24 hours, but I mean, they showed right away that they were faster than the Ferraris, and if they could develop the durability, they were going to be players.
So once again, Ferrari wins Le Mans in 1964, first, second, and third. With none of the GT40s getting anywhere near a finish line, Henry Ford II is not happy. They need to make changes. Ford needed a guy who knew something about the 24 Hours of Le Mans, maybe a driver who had beaten Ferrari before, and they found the guy. It was said of him he could charm the leaves off a tree.
Got my driver's license at 14 years old, and the first thing I do is take my dad's 34 Dodge out and get caught by the cop for driving 85 miles an hour.
Carroll Shelby started road racing at its very infancy up in Watkins Glen in some of the very first races ever run in our country after the war. And he won everything. And he wore his bib overalls, and he was a showman.
The rivalry between Enzo Ferrari and Shelby started way back in the late 1950s when Shelby was a driver. Ferrari wanted to hire Shelby, and Shelby refused him.
I decided to stay with Aston Martin because of the internal politics at Ferrari.
Now the winner pulls in to be submerged beneath a seething mass, eager to acclaim a resounding victory.
This is 1959. He and Roy Salvadori had just won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in an Aston Martin. He was at the peak of his racing career.
He wins that, and he's dying. And it wasn't even a half an hour before the race, he came up and he said his heart was going. And he said, I don't think I can run.
I knew that I had hereditary problems, and my father had died at 46 years old with it, so I figured there was nothing that could be done.
Drove with a nitroglycerin pill under his tongue, to keep the thing down.
We won the 24-hour race, and it was the luckiest break up to that time that it ever happened to me because it opened the door for a lot of opportunities for me down the road.
Carroll didn't know for sure what he was going to do in his life, but one of the things that he could do was he wanted to build his own sports car.
All this time I had been planning to try to build a car that utilized the American V8s.
So Pete Brock left General Motors and he went to Carroll Shelby.
You got to realize we're a very small group. We're like about 8 guys total.
We had hot rodders from Japan, France, Italy, Switzerland, England, New Zealand, Australia. And all these guys worked together amazingly well.
It was a great shop to work in. It was like one big family, abusing each other.
We were a ragtag bunch of crazy guys, kind of out of control.
There was always lots of pranks going on, cherry bombs and all that kind of stuff. But basically, yes, everyone got on very well together.
Shelby was really in the right place at the right time. He had all of these young people, these hot rodders who knew how to make cars go fast, who knew how to fabricate. And he had Phil Remington, who was this technical genius.
Sometimes he goes by the title of chief engineer, sometimes general manager of racing.
Remington is one of the few figures in racing who's become a legend who's not a race car driver or constructor.
Phil Remington was pretty much responsible for all of our successes in racing over there.
Phil Remington is like the unsung hero of all of 1960s racing. He was a genius. He could fix anything. He could fabricate anything. And he told the kids in Shelby's shop what to do. All of that together, you had an amazing company.
Corvettes were the prominent car in racing at that point. And Shelby definitely, he definitely wanted to beat the Corvettes, there's no doubt about it.
He knew if he wanted to make a name for himself as a car manufacturer, he had to build a Corvette killer.
He was able to get an introduction to go to Detroit and meet Lee Iacocca and try to sell him on the idea of an American sports car.
We had the capability of mass-producing reliable engines, and that's what he needed.
They'd given him about 10 minutes to give his elevator talk on what he was going to do. And he was still talking as they pushed him out the door, you know, and finally Iacocca said, just get that guy out of here, give him a couple engines and some money, and let's see what he can do. Carroll went over to the AC car company in England and said, Ford Motor Company's behind me, and we're going to build this big corporation and build all these sports cars. And would you guys supply us a couple of chassis for nothing?
Between whipsawing both of them, I wound up with a chassis and 4 or 5 engines from Ford.
So they built the chassis, we put the engines in them, and the first Cobra was put together. When we had the first head-to-head competition at Riverside, obviously all the top West Coast Corvette drivers were there.
It took care of the Corvette pretty handily, and people at Ford noticed that.
In 1963, we won the Drivers' Championship, the Manufacturers' Championship, and of course the USRC Championship.
It was a recognition that Carroll, along with Ford, had found something special. We had our first true competitor in the racing car business in a while.
No matter how good it was for short track racing, it was not going to be a suitable car for Europe because it simply didn't have the top speed.
Everybody knew that they just stopped dead around 150. They were just like running this barn door through the air.
I said to Carroll, we can design a completely new body for the existing Cobra chassis, and I think that we can make them go faster. But I said, it may not look like anything you've ever seen before. And he said, oh, hell, I don't care what it looks like. Is it going to go fast? And I said, I believe it will. There wasn't any time to do this. We had a 90-day window to build this car from the first sketch to the completed running car to get it ready for Daytona.
If you wanted to make a change on a car, you would just make the changes. So you could actually evolve a race car much, much quicker than any factory could do it.
And we got the car done and took it out to Riverside. Right out of the box, the car was 3.5 seconds faster than anything we'd ever run.
Shelby named the car for the race he was preparing it for, the Daytona Continental. So since that day, it's always been known as the Cobra Daytona.
So our next race, of course, was Le Mans. And we've got 2 Daytonas in the GT class.
In 4th place overall and leading the GT division, the Cobra driven by Dan Gurney and Bob Bondurant.
They're competing against one of the lead Ferraris, and they run those guys into the ground.
In 1964, winning Le Mans in the GT class is huge for Shelby and for the Daytona Coupe.
It was absolutely amazing that a group of guys from Venice, California could come down here and beat all those high-end manufacturers.
We didn't win. The cars didn't finish.
Henry Ford II is not pleased.
He wanted somebody who had demonstrated that ability to win. Carroll Shelby had won Le Mans as a driver, had won Le Mans as a manufacturer with the Daytona Coupe, and it was after '64 that he brought in Carroll Shelby to help develop the cars.
Here's something else that we're excited about. It's this new Ford GT. It was designed and built by Ford engineers as kind of a laboratory on wheels to test new ideas and prove Ford's capabilities in open competition. We've been given the job of testing this new car and racing internationally.
The biggest concern for them was endurance. These 12-hour and 24-hour races are, demanding beyond reason. Carroll Shelby knew the task before them.
I can remember when the 2 GT40s actually came into our shop. They still had wire wheels on them, and they were overheating, and so Phil went to work on that.
Phil Remington is the best mechanic I've ever seen in my life.
Rem was like a fireman looking for a fire. Very quick on coming up with solutions.
A lot of the subsystems, braking subsystems, everything was redesigned.
Changed the suspension geometry, they changed the engine. They did everything they could in the short amount of time they had before Daytona.
Ken Miles was the test driver, really. He basically tested and developed most all the cars. He was an engineer prior to going to Shelby's and prior to opening his own business.
Ken Miles drove it at first. He didn't like it at all. I hopped in it and I drove it, and it didn't handle great. So I brought it back, told Remington what it's doing, and so he adjusted the ride heights and suspension, changed the shocks on it, and stiffened it up. So each time that he worked on it, it got better and better and better.
"43 cars, 29 from Europe and 14 from America, will start the 2,000-kilometer Daytona Continental."
So the GT40s show up at Daytona in 1965. Shelby's had less than 2 months to turn these cars into winners.
The race is on.
At the beginning of the race, Bob Bondurant in the GT40 flies by Surtees in a Ferrari.
By the time we got to turn 2, I was doing 200 miles an hour, and I pulled Surtees 18 car lengths. The car felt great. I thought, yes, we fixed it, and it worked.
With all the changes that Remington made and Ken made and even Carroll Smith, they got the car moving very quickly.
Trouble on the third turn. Rodriguez is slowing to a stop on the course. The Ferrari's European tires blew, beating the rear end and battery to pieces.
This race was the first race that GT40s finished.
The last lap. The Americans have won. They've overthrown the Ferrari.
This was a magnificent win for Shelby, and you could say that this victory, maybe even more than his Le Mans win in 1959 as a driver, this is the win that first really put him on the map.
The next race for the factory team was at Sebring.
Ferrari had pulled out of Sebring in protest. Even though Ferrari withdrew, this would turn out to be a great test for Shelby and the new Ford.
Then the rains came.
It's the worst deluge ever recorded at Sebring.
You'd take a tire off to change it, and if you didn't grab it, it literally would float away.
Porsches and Fords began to close in on the Chaparral, cutting the lead in half. Suddenly, the 12-hour Sebring Grand Prix of Endurance is over. Number 11 Ford GT is first in the Grand Touring Prototype class.
If we're successful at Daytona and we're successful at Sebring.
By the time Ford is getting its cars ready to ship to France, suddenly people are starting to describe Ferrari as an underdog. Ford is expected to keep pace in this race and maybe win.
This is the year of Ford's great challenge, an American invasion on the supremacy of the Italian giants.
Ford was racing 4 of the 289 Ford GTs and 2 427 Mark IIs.
The pre-race drama had centered on the strongest ever challenge from Americans. They declared an intention to beat Ferrari.
In 1965, it was starting to get really serious.
My car worked fantastic. I was third fastest qualifier.
Ford had really built some good engines, and somebody at Ford decided to rebuild them just before Le Mans.
Night before, Ford said, change all the engines.
Ford debuted in 1964. There was a huge audience. In 1965, there was an even bigger audience. For the first time at Le Mans, an American car is actually favored to win. People were expecting this car to beat the Ferraris.
Chris Amons first away in the Ford 7-liter, followed by Bob Bondurant, Bruce McLaren, and Surtees. At the S's, the 7-liter Ford GTs are pulling away from the works Ferraris, as the leading Ford sets a blistering pace.
And when the race starts, Bruce McLaren in one of the 427s and Chris Amon in the second 427, they lead at the start, and by the time they're at the end of the Mulsanne straight, the Ferraris aren't even in sight.
We got a great start, and I knew I had a great chance to win.
But now the McLaren Miles Ford is in gearbox trouble. Already the Ferrari grip on the race tightens.
The Le Mans race in '65 was an absolute berserker because the cars were quick. I mean, the cars were running quick, but we had all kinds of engine problems and vibrations.
What happened was they got some new head bolts and they didn't check them out, and all the head bolts stretched.
One thing about the Ferrari car was that you were unlikely to break it mechanically.
For all that having a 7-litre engine against a 4-litre engine sounds one-sided, the Ferraris were so much more sophisticated that they weren't a long way behind on horsepower, and they were light, so they could make the car work better.
By midnight, with the race only 1/3 through, the Ford Challenge had been shattered by Ferrari.
All the cars broke.
Ford made the decision to tell Shelby to take them all out and put in Ford engines. It was a disaster.
If I had not changed an engine, I would have won.
Again, the Fords broke. They made simple engineering mistakes, and Ferrari didn't. Only one Ferrari prototype finished the race, but that was enough to win it. And Ferrari also won the GT class, and they finished 1, 2, 3 overall.
The press called it murder, Italian style.
It was the second year for my grandfather of utter disappointment, and I'm sure he probably questioned in his mind whether this was all worth it.
Ford, with millions and millions of dollars going down the tube again, start to look bad.
This was humiliating. Henry Ford II was pissed.
He made it very clear that we were not going to fail again.
Henry Ford II was not the chairman or the president of Ford Motor Company. He was the emperor. And he had a way of making statements that if you don't win, you're out of here.
I was with Don Fry and Leo Beebe when he called us in, and he had the name tag made in '65. September, it says Ford wins Le Mans in '66. You want a job next June, don't you?
Ford decided to expand its operation. So instead of just having Shelby American, they also hired Holman and Moody, who was already running their stock car operation, and Alan Mann Racing, which had just won the GT championship with the Cobra Daytona Coupe.
When I came back, a lot of the crew were missing. They were gone. They didn't need as many people to run GT40s because they already had those people set. So anyone who was working on the Daytona Coupe kind of got their walking papers.
At the end of the '65 season, I got back, there was a total stranger in my office there. You know, they'd come in taking over. Shelby didn't really fire me, but, you know, it was obvious that they didn't need me around there anymore.
Enzo Ferrari did not tolerate mistakes, especially when it came to engineering. And if engineers did make a mistake, he made sure they knew about it.
Tutti I pezzi che si erano rotti durante gli anni con le Ferrari che correvano. E lo chiamava il Museo degli Orrori, perché noi potevamo vedere quante stupidaggini avevamo fatto.
Every component broken, displayed in that room, was representing a race that had been lost.
He said that the responsible people, every time we are here for a meeting, they have the possibility to see the parts which have broken, so they will not repeat the same mistake.
'66 was really important for Ford to win, so the pressure was on.
It was obvious that we were going to have to retire the little engine and go to the big engine. Even with modifications in favor of fixing the weakness of the 289, it just didn't get the job done.
'65 was a disaster, but if we had run second or third or possibly even lucked out and won the race, we might never have gotten the funding to go like we did in '66 and '7.
But it was the beginning of what they knew would be the direction to go with the big block cars.
As a driver, of course, I mean, you always go for the power. The 289 at the very beginning left a lot to be desired. There just was not the power that the driver's looking for.
Ultimately, of course, they came out with the Mark IIs.
And they said, right, we've got to get this job done. So if we can't do it by cunning and daring, we'll do it by just brute force, and we'll put this bloody great engine in and we'll blow them away.
The 427 in that application was a brute. It wasn't like sending a boy to do a man's job. I mean, it fit the use.
When they went to the bigger engines, all of a sudden, all the drivers were smiling. And that's when we started seeing some real speeds. The weight of the car needed to have the torque and so forth, you know, to be able to compete with, what we were up against with Ferraris.
Here in Test Cell 17D, without car or driver, the 1966 Le Mans race has already run 6 months before it actually happened.
I do remember going to a Ford engine test stand, and it had a Le Mans system in it. So it had robots that shifted the gears. It'd go through all 4 gears and had a 427 engine. And you could tell when it was on the Mulsanne straight and where it would slow down for the right-hand turn at the end. So they could run that car, I think the longest they ran was like 40 hours or something. With the Mark II GT40 and the FE 427 engine, it was so understated and undertuned that it just goes. At 6,400, to be able to run 220 miles an hour and do it all day long, not even straining itself. And the drivers liked that because it felt solid. It felt like the engine was going to be there for the entire event. Rem was very much involved with the Mark II, along with Ken Miles.
As a test driver, I also got to test some of the cars on behalf of Carroll Shelby, too. We knew we had some brake issues, especially Le Mans because of the Mulsanne Straight. So you got 3.2 miles, and the brakes would go from 1,200 degrees to 0 every single lap. And at that point, I don't think they had the material that would withstand, that repeated cycle.
Phil Remington figured out how to make a quick change brake setup on them. They could change the discs and the calipers and the whole braking system on it.
When somebody like Dan Gurney has to get in that car, I mean, they had to build a bubble into the roofline to be able to fit his helmet in the car.
I was 6'4". So when you get into that car, you were sitting on the actual chassis. The roof is hitting your helmet. So there wasn't anywhere else to go. So they had to go up on the roof, and that's where the bubble came in.
Racing for the flag in the 24-hour Daytona Continental.
Ford had 5 GT40 Mark IIs in the running, led by Ken Miles and Lloyd Ruby, and Dan Gurney and Jerry Grant.
Miles takes the lead as they thunder towards the second go-around the infield, pushing the last Ferrari threat.
Miles and Gurney basically led the whole race. And it was like a start-to-finish race, too. It was incredible. I mean, it was just a relatively easy race.
For the first time, Ford wins 1-2-3 at Daytona.
This is the 12 hours of Sebring. And during the next 12 hours, we're going to have a lot of questions answered that are in the minds of racing fans everywhere. Can the Fords win 2 in a row, such as they did with the Continental, the long road race, this being the second one on the road to Le Mans? And can Ferrari come back after a rather dismal start at the beginning of this year?
Can you tell us who your rabbits will be and who your steady boys will be? Well, I think we'll have Dan Gurney out front.
We were going to be the rabbit.
To be the rabbit is someone that obviously, is quite quick. You want to entice the competition to follow that and try to destroy the equipment. If you're designated as rabbit, that means that you're expendable. That's part of team play strategy.
Dan Gurney's going like a rocket. It's neck and neck now. Parks, Miles, Gurney close enough to cover with a blanket as they roar through the Webster.
Ken was running second. I think at that point, Dan had lapped Ken. And Ken would come into the pits, and I'd say, Ken, you've got to get your finger out. I said, Gurney's going to win this race if you don't watch it. He says, I'm not that worried, he says, because Dan is pulling me out of every turn. I mean, he's definitely overdriven that vehicle. And I said, well, it's not that much further to go, Ken.
Ninth full on. It's Ford, Ford, Ferrari, Ford, Ford. Report of another accident. The third place Rodriguez Andretti Ferrari is in and damaged. Fire. Quickly out. But that should do it for the only Ferrari capable of challenging the Ford.
You know, get the car back in the pits, and then the engine caught fire. You know, so we were out of that race.
Here's Ruby bringing the Ford prototype in to hand over to teammate Miles. They've driven a great race following their 24-hour win at Daytona, but it looks like second at Sebring.
And it is 10 o'clock straight up. The checkered flag is out, and no Dan Gurney.
For Pete's sake, here he is, and he's pushing it. He could be disqualified for that.
It looked like Dan was going to win until the last lap, and it puked.
Gurney is actually pushing car number 2 in, and that means Ken Miles has crossed the finish line first.
Ken was a lap down at that point. He had to circle Sebring one more time before he actually won the race. Dan hadn't touched the car, just left it where it was, he would have finished second. Because he started to push it, it was all over, he got disqualified.
And obviously elated but surprised, Miles enjoys the victory lane hubbub, while everyone wonders what happened to Gurney.
How'd she quit?
Engine trouble?
I believe so.
How long did you push it?
Oh, probably almost a quarter mile.
Ken Miles, are you as surprised as we are?
I'm slightly ashamed.
Well, it was a big day for Ford, wasn't it?
It was a good day for Ford. I'm very happy with the Ford Motor Company. I'm very sorry indeed for Dan. He really deserved to win the race. He drove a beautiful race, and I'm sorry that something happened at the last minute.
How did Lloyd go for you? This is your third big long-distance win together, isn't it?
I like Lloyd.
What's next for you?
Le Mans.
Suddenly, Ken Miles has emerged as the driver to beat in the Shelby team, having won Daytona and Sebring in 1966. Sebring is another 1-2-3 finish for the Ford GT40s. All that's left is Le Mans.
Ford had already a couple of years under 64, 65. Come 66, when the success, started to be real, even from the competitor standpoint, such as Ferrari, all of a sudden said, these guys are not going away. Then they started paying some attention.
Ford had possibility to invest an incredible amount of money compared to his possibilities. This was something which really did spoil the Ferrari idea about being capable to fight against such a giant.
Uno dei dirigenti della Ford, che io conoscevo molto bene, venne a casa e grazie a Shelby mi offrì di andare in California con casa, macchina, università eventualmente per i miei figli e uno stipendio che era 3, 4, 5 volte quello che io prendevo alla Ferrari. Che io dovevo molto a Ferrari, non solo perché mi aveva preso in Ferrari, ma perché mi aveva permesso di essere me stesso in tutti i momenti più difficili che la Ferrari aveva avuto.
I learned that Enzo Ferrari wanted to meet me. So I went down and met him, and he said, "Would you like to run with us?" I said, "Yeah, I would."
In 1966, Bob Bongerin swapped from Ford to the enemy, drove for Ferrari at Le Mans.
Enzo Ferrari was smart. He hired me because I was beating him all the time.
66 was a great year for the GT40. We won Daytona 1-2-3, we won Sebring 1-2-3.
By the time they got to Le Mans, I think everyone was feeling a lot more confident than they had been in 64 and 65.
Then you say to the boss, "Hey, listen, we got a really good idea for you. Why don't you come to Le Mans and start the race, and we'll see if we can't win it for you." I went to Le Mans with him in 1966. He had a smile on his face the minute we got on the airplane. I mean, he was really excited. He was going over to beat the Europeans on their own turf.
Well, we did all right the first couple of times out. The field of cars were very impressive at Daytona and Sebring. In the weeks to come, we hope to continue our string of victories. It's a cinch that whatever success we find, we'll also find our share of disappointments.
The Le Mans test in 66, it was raining and drizzling, and when it's raining, I mean, there's no point, and you're not going to break any track records in the rain. We already figured out that the cars were going to be quick in the rain with the right tires.
Walter Hanskin was driving a Mark II GT40.
Miles, who was a brilliant rain driver, he'd already come in the pits. He said, you're bringing water in, it's just taking too many chances out, then we don't need to go any quicker because it's raining.
Carroll Smith tried to slow him down.
It's almost like he refused to come in. He was just going round and round, and finally at the end of the chute, at that one right-hander, he just went straight on. But, you know, that's motor racing. Some of these drivers, when they're in that car, they just, they give it everything they got.
These things are unavoidable. He lost it, and it killed him.
But it rolled that car up in a little ball, that GT40. It was almost like it wasn't even made out of steel. It just crumpled up around him.
Now, with the preliminaries over, Le Mans is underway.
Ford entered 8 GT40 Mark IIs. Ferrari entered 7 cars. The table is set. 1966 will be the showdown between Ford and Ferrari.
Ford went to Le Mans, the 900-pound gorilla. But that said, they had a history of failing at Le Mans the past 2 years, and in fact, they'd never had a car finish at Le Mans. Even though I'd say they were the odds-on favorite, I'm not sure everyone was betting on them.
We had a strategy, and we thought the only way we would beat the Fords would be if we could go along and from the very start of the race, we could drive it like a Grand Prix. Because the drivers in the Fords were all racers, and they wouldn't just hold back. They would have a go, and there was some possibility that we might be able to break the Fords.
There's the Ferrari team, and car number 20 was scheduled to be driven by John Surtees of England. But shortly before the start of the race, we learned that he wasn't going to drive, and we asked him about it.
Yes, unfortunately, you've heard correct. I won't be driving.
What is the reason?
Well, I suppose it is best summed up at this stage by saying the political reason.
When I got back for the actual race, Dragoni said, we've got to change the policies because Mr. Agnelli is going to be here and he'd like his nephew, Scaffiotti, to start the race. I said, it's ridiculous. That year, we'd done 1 or 2 moves where we'd lost races because of pure strategy. So I went back to Ferrari and said, enough is enough. I'm not going to be treated this way. I'm here to win races. I'm off.
Surtees was a victim of the internal politics, and he was another guy who walked away, as did Phil Hill. It didn't matter how much you won. For some people, important people inside the team, if you weren't Italian, you weren't Ferrari.
For Ferrari to lose Surtees right before the race, it's massive. I mean, this man was a true talent. Still to this day, he's the only man who's won world championships on 2 wheels and 4. So without him, Ferrari was handicapped, for sure.
This race had been billed from the very start as a race between the Ferraris and the Ford team. There are 55 cars lined up, ready to go, and of course they are employing what has become famous in all parts of the world for the Le Mans start.
The famous Le Mans start, was you run across, you jump in a car. Even though you had safety belts, most of the drivers, they just want to get out there. They wouldn't even buckle up.
The main thing was to concentrate on getting the engine running and getting out of there. And then you'd later on do your seatbelt, if there was a seatbelt.
Going down the Mulsanne straight, you try to hold the thing, maybe buckle up, maybe not. Ford, actually, in the 66 race, they had strict orders to drivers. I don't care if you're going to be there half an hour. You got to buckle up, before you leave, which was very prudent. But did the drivers listen? Hell no.
Ken and Gurney were the rabbits, so their job was to go out and break the Ferraris. When the race started, Ken Miles didn't get his door closed correctly, so he got a terrible start. And I thought, oh, this ended right from the beginning. The next 20 laps or so was just incredible, and Ken was hauling ass. I mean, he was just going so quick. And finally, after a couple of hours probably, he was up in the second spot behind Dan.
Phil, the tremendous talk here has been on the pace of this race. What is your comment?
It's a terrific pace. I mean, I'm sure before the thing's over, we're going to see an awful lot of cars that just aren't around anymore.
You think there'll be a lot of them falling out?
I think so.
Car number 8, that's Don Whitmore, the driver. And this was quite a surprise that he made a stop so early in this race. And incidentally, we had the official report on that. He had a broken brake line.
Six hours in, 2 of the GT40s are already retired, as well as 2 Ferraris.
The Mark II number 1, being driven by Ken Miles and Dennis Holm, is leading, but it has been a battle all along between car number 1 and car number 3, Dan Gurney and Ken Miles, and the Ferrari being driven by Rodriguez and Ginther.
Dan Gurney's car died about the 11th hour.
With Jerry Grant, we led the race for a long time and then had a failure of a head gasket.
It's a brutal race. It's an endurance race, and it epitomized the word endurance.
Only 2 drivers drove, so you were going to split it 12 and 12, or somebody do 14 and somebody do 10.
You don't wake up and go 24 hours and then go to sleep. You've already been awake for 10, 15 hours before that in the pits.
Especially at Le Mans, we never stopped for 1 second. I would never get any sleep. I was just too wound up.
You're about ready to drop dead. Complete and utter physical exhaustion.
But we're still running away with the race. Ken and Danny are still really hauling ass. I mean, he's doing a great job.
The Ferraris are dropping out.
Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon, they were running several laps back, but still running really strong. As the race was a few hours from the finish, it looked like the car wasn't going to break anyway. Ken was going to win the race easily.
Miles is now in first place, and he's lapping at amazing speeds, faster than they told him he should be going. Miles has won Daytona. Miles has won Sebring. So if Ken Miles wins Le Mans, it would be the Triple Crown.
No driver had won 3 premier long-distance endurance races of the era.
The word came down, presumably from my grandfather, that he wanted to facilitate this 1-2-3 finish.
Henry Ford told Carroll, he said, you got to slow him down.
When they told Ken, he was very, very upset. He's leaning on the pit wall waiting for his stint on the drive, and that's when he first told me they want me to back off. I was like, you're 3 laps ahead of them. How are they going to slow you down with 3 laps? He said, well, they want to slow me down on the back chute and then longer pit stops and things like that. I said, well, no. I said, that ain't going to happen because I'm not going to slow down on bloody pit stops. They've talked to the Le Mans officials saying that we can do a dead heat, which still meant that Ken had to slow down to let Bruce catch up, which he did.
Ford won 1, 2, 3, and Henry Ford was so happy. He beat Ferrari.
It was a relief for a lot of people because this was a Herculean effort to make this program a success. And so when it finally paid off, I can't imagine how it must have felt for people who had dedicated years of their life to this program.
Your eyes water up. There's a lot of hugging and handshaking and so on. It was just a magnificent feeling.
I felt wonderful about us winning 1, 2, and 3.
Ford won the 1966 race fair and square by having every base covered. They had a car for every eventuality.
It was a shock, of course, but you know, that's motor racing. You know, one day you lose. You know.
I think we were lucky You know, we had 6 cars. We, felt really good about our chances, and we came in 1, 2, 3.
When it came to a finish, it was actually considered a dead heat, even though in the pictures it looked like Bruce was further ahead than Ken. But when Ken came up the pit lane to head for the winner's circle, we thought we'd have won the race. And we get to the winner's circle, and they go waving him off, yelling in French, you know.
And then the FIA got involved and said, well, just so you know,
if there is a dead heat across the finishing line, the car that started farthest back on the starting line must have covered the greatest distance. So number 2 becomes the winner.
There wasn't going to be a 1, 2, 3 finish. Bruce was going to win.
We made a horrible decision with Ken Miles in saying the 3 cars come over exactly together. It was good politically for Ford, so I couldn't argue with it. Besides that, I worked for Ford. And I'm not going to go against Henry Ford.
Ken ended up getting cheated out of it. And it wasn't fair either, because he would have been the first driver to win those 3 big races.
And it broke his heart.
When they win the race, and he's asked, well, what happens now? Henry Ford says, well, we're going to come back next year and do it again.
Ma Ferrari venne da me e mi disse, Mauro, la P3 ha perso, puoi migliorare la P3, perché allungammo il passo, mettemmo un motore a 3 valvole con le trombette curve, un nuovo cambio, nuove sospensioni. E la P3 è scomparsa, è nata una P4 0846.
It's a development of the P3, but it's better. It's beautiful. It looks stunning. It's got a new engine that's derived from their Formula One engine, and it just kicks ass.
At the latter part of '66, Carroll Shelby, Phil Remington, and the Shelby experts were making a faster, quicker Mark IIB.
My grandfather was determined to make sure that people knew that this was not some kind of fluke. And so development of the cars continued in '66. The J car was a prototype that they had used this kind of honeycomb pattern, and I don't think they knew exactly how durable it was.
So they sent it out to testing at Riverside. The car was being tested by Ken Miles. The car broke, and when the car broke, he was doing 180 miles an hour. It careened wildly. He went over the cliff. It was unsurvivable. We were all devastated, but I knew Charlie was by far the most devastated. I mean, this guy was like a father to him.
When Ken died, I wasn't there, unfortunately. I never really lost a driver.
It was a very tragic end to an amazing career.
In 1967, when the season began at Daytona, Ford showed up with a full array of upgraded Mark IIs.
Ferrari wanted revenge after '66. So he had the P4s and a P3-4, and he brought like 6 cars or something. They were factory cars. This was going to be a real showdown and a real race. They had all these entries, and they were all big blocks. A horrible goddamn thing. They started coming in one after the other with broken transmissions.
Only 1 out of 6 GT40s finished at Daytona in 1967. Enzo Ferrari gets his revenge.
Ferrari won the 24 hours of Daytona with a 1-2-3 rival with a 2 P4 and 1-4-1-2.
Ferrari, having lost at Le Mans, got a little bit of its own back by going to Daytona.
Early in the career, they had not been as durable as the opposition. This is the first time that Ford had ever been slower than the opposition. So at that point, it became clear to the hierarchy there that something needed to be done. And it wasn't clear how to make the Mark II decidedly faster in a short period of time. Phil Remington returned to Dearborn with two of his chief fabricators, and they took the first J-car chassis, and they took it into the wind tunnel, and they started literally cutting away at the bodywork to try to improve the aerodynamics of the car. They came up with a shape that was so dramatically different than the J-car that they dubbed the new car the Mark IV.
The Mark IV was perfect out of the box. It was completely designed and built, the whole car, in the United States, not England, no Italian gearbox, nothing. You didn't have to take it out and get it ported. You didn't have to get it balanced. You didn't have to build an engine. Right out of the box. And the engines, they had part numbers on them.
You could go to a Ford dealer and purchase the exact parts that are in that engine, assemble your own race engine, and get the same performance out of it. For us, that was our goal.
And they went out and tested that almost immediately thereafter out in Arizona, and it proved to be faster right out of the box than the existing Mark II. So that's when it was decided to race the Mark IV at Sebring, and if it did well at Sebring, they would go ahead and take that to Le Mans.
Fast is the competitively untested Ford Mark IV. The super sleek lemon yellow Mark IV is Ford's standard bearer. Bruce McLaren and Mario Andretti will be at the controls.
What about your strategy in the 12 hours?
Well, I think we have a car that should be fast enough to lead it if qualifications are any indication at all.
Ford's only other factory entry, a slightly reworked version of last year's victorious Mark II. Lloyd Ruby and A.J. Foyt are in command.
After Daytona, Ferrari's P4s were so dominant, he didn't even bother sending them to Sebring. The competition would be between Carroll Shelby's GT40 Mark II-B versus the brand new Mark IV.
Foyt's piloting the highest placed Ford at the moment and charging through the throng in the Mark II. By the S's, the Fords have gobbled up the quick-starting Alfa, and McLaren has assumed command with Foyt second.
We go out there, and we're running 7 to 10 seconds a lap faster than Foyt. And I never had a better day in my life.
The lead car pulls in. McLaren and Andretti have done a magnificent job in the new Mark IV.
We raced at a Sebring the first time and won with Bruce McLaren as my partner. And so, as you could see, at Mark IV, I became the envy of the competition.
Ford comes back to Le Mans in 1967 with a whole new goal. They want to be the first American manufacturer to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans with a team of all-American drivers.
It's race week, and along with nearly every gendarme in the south of France comes the world's finest racing machinery.
It would be the first time that the Mark IV and the P4 would face each other on the racetrack. And these are two, really iconic cars, representative of two different kind of philosophies in race car design and construction, but both aimed towards the same end. There are so many good cars there. And there were probably 8 or 10 cars with a legitimate shot of winning.
The world was waiting to see what was going to happen.
World-famous drivers, Mario Andretti, winner of the most recent international endurance race at Sebring. A.J. Foyt and Dan Gurney raced against each other at Indy just 12 days earlier. Now they are teammates driving one of the new Mark IV Fords. Foyt gets ready for practice in the #1 Mark IV. He's never driven the track before, and this is the first time he's been in the sleek new Ford.
We started practice, and we have an issue with the cracked windshields.
When the incredibly fast Fords reach their peak speeds in excess of 215 miles per hour, small pebbles are picked up from the new surface and thrown with enough velocity to crack the windshields. They must all be replaced, and the supply is short.
Ford took out first class on one of the airliners, and this sent, I think it was about a dozen or so windshields.
During the night, one special aircraft came from Detroit directly to Le Mans with new material. Ferrari couldn't have the financial possibility to do something like that.
Ferrari Ferrari has 3 of their factory P4s in the top 10, and they finished 1, 2, 3 in the only other 24-hour race of the season at Daytona. The candy-colored Fords are the fastest, with 6 of the top 10 starting positions. Ronnie Bucknam, driving the number 57 Ford Mark II, leads the pack off the starting grid. Bucknam leads the pack down Mulsanne Straight.
He's in the car and gone, and he comes back after the first lap 30 seconds ahead of the second-place car.
Here comes the rest of the pack, 2 Ferrari P4s and 2 Fords.
As the race progressed, the Fords took the lead. The Ferraris were not too far behind, but we were pulling away from them.
Now, from the air, we see Gurney quickly accelerating to become the leader on the 48th lap. Foyt begins his 2-hour stint behind the wheel, his first appearance in competition at Le Mans, and with only 10 practice laps under his belt. At this stage, Gurney thinks things are going too easy. The expected challenge from Ferrari hasn't developed. Maybe he set too fast a pace. 15 cars have already dropped out trying to keep up with the bright red Ford. And now there's a rookie driver in the car.
GT40, if it has an Achilles heel, it's in the brakes. It would go about 212, 213 down the straightaway. Then you come to the Mulsanne turn, and you have to slow down to maybe 30 miles an hour. That can really raise Cain with the brakes. So I had invented a new approach of braking. The chicken shit form of braking that I use instead of the deep braking. What I did was back off about 300 yards sooner than I had to and let the engine slow the car down, and then I'd brake and downshift and go around the corner. Well, this was much easier for the brakes. That was something that I worked with AJ on. So we went at this thing with a slightly different philosophy of how to do it.
A.J. Foyt, the rookie everyone was worrying about, has charged into a 7-lap lead.
We got Foyt and Gurney, and nobody expected him to finish.
Gurney did a beautiful job of not showing Foyt how fast the car would go, and Foyt did a fabulous job in driving within his limits, realizing that 24 hours is a long time, taking care of the engine, taking care of the gearbox.
Mr. Ford had his sergeants with him, but they would come through every 2 or 3 hours, and that happened all night long. Fortunate for us, we always had good news at the time.
At 3:30 in the morning, the whole complexion of the race changes when Andretti spins his car, bounces off the wall, and stops in the middle of the track. Seconds later, McCluskey and Joe Schlesser spin out, trying to avoid Andretti. No one is injured, but all 3 cars must be retired.
Ferrari hadn't given up, and Ford did everything they could to help Ferrari stay in the race. They lost 3 cars in 1 accident.
2 factory Ferraris are in hot pursuit, now in 2nd and 3rd position. Bruce McLaren is in 4th position, and as he accelerates along the Mulsanne Straight, the top of his car comes loose. He's forced to slow down and hold it on by hand.
There was only 1 Ford left, and that happened to be ours.
E noi perdemmo anche le nostre macchine, ne rimase una, quella di Scarfiotti Parks. Solo che Scarfiotti stette molto male, ebbe dei problemi allo stomaco e quindi Mike Parks fu costretto a fare 3 turni. 3 turni a Le Mans allora erano molto duri.
Less than 4 hours to go, Dan Gurney drives the number 1 Ford for his last shift before turning it over to A.J. Foyt, waiting in the pits, who is scheduled to finish the race. The Ferraris begin to pick up the pace, hoping to push the leading Ford into a breakdown.
The Ford was about 3 miles an hour faster than
Ferrari. Even though he was in my draft, I could walk away from him down the straightaway a little bit. And then when I backed off early, he was all over me and flicking his lights. This happened for, say, 4 or 5 laps. Every time when we came to the last 90-degree turn at the end of the Mulsanne Straight, he was right on me. It was really bothering me. And finally, I got to a turn called Arnage, and I went around the turn and slowly pulled off onto the right, onto the grass, and stopped. And he pulled off behind me and stopped right behind me on the grass. So I thought to myself, now what? And it stayed that way for probably 10 or 12 seconds. And then finally he pulled out and went on. He ended up finishing second.
Ferrari were always fairly close to the pace, but never close enough. It was the steamroller again. Weight of numbers, Ford won.
There's the checkered flag. Dan Gurney climbs atop the Ford Mark IV. It's an All-American win. The veteran Dan Gurney from California, the hard-charging A.J. Foyt from Texas, and the durable Mark IV Ford from Dearborn, Michigan.
Foyt and Gurney were the least likely winners, and we were given them, and everybody thought they'd blow up. Well, they didn't.
The Ford guys were just over the moon. I mean, everything they could have wanted, they got at Le Mans in '67, which was great. Foyt was lighting cigars and cigarettes with 100-franc bills. I mean, it was just, everyone was going berserk.
We're all up on the platform. At that moment, I was handed a gigantic bottle of champagne. It was a huge achievement. After trying many times, there were 7 times where I didn't even finish. I just felt, let's do something here.
Dan Gurney does something amazing. He sprays the crowd with champagne. Nobody had ever done that.
Like a fire hose, I could get every single one of them and didn't realize what it would evolve into.
Now, in every race, particularly in Europe, people win, they pop the champagne and spray it. It all started right there at Le Mans in 1967.
It meant a great deal to all of us.
Ford went on to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans again in 1968, again in 1969, and Ferrari never won Le Mans again. The Ford-Ferrari rivalry, that is the golden age of racing.
There's been a great battle, a great fight.
It's really a part of the history of motor racing.
It's easy to think of the GT40 as being the iconic car of the time. But the Ferraris that were racing against them were, in their own way, the most sophisticated sports cars ever built.
You mentioned Ferrari. Anywhere on the planet, everybody knows what they're all about. They're all about high performance and winning. Clear.
Ferrari did win everything worth winning, and he did it entirely his own way. He delivered huge results and with a massive personality.
I'm often asked, really, what was the best car you ever drove? Top of the list is the GT40.
American-made cars all of a sudden had a new appreciation globally.
Once you achieve what that GT40 has achieved, you're in the history forever. It's part of an incredible accomplishment, you know, in the most competitive arena.
The legacy of the GT40 and the Ferraris that raced against it was really to start the modern generation of Le Mans. It was the start of big money factory teams, really changed from being specially prepared sports racing cars to being cars designed from the ground up just to do Le Mans.
Now the cars are bulletproof, the drivers drive flat out. We couldn't do that.
It doesn't matter what brand or what car or who's racing. In the end, we all just have this drive to compete.
That I've been so lucky to be on the same track with the best drivers that ever put their hands on the steering wheel of a race car.
Only two makes ever won Le Mans in the 1960s. Ferrari won the first half, Ford won the second half.
In the history of motor racing, there will never be another rivalry like the Ford and Ferrari wars at Le Mans. It's one of the great grudge matches of history, not just motorsports, but all of sporting history.
Such a historic occasion, 50 years on from the 1-2-3 finish, and we're back for another crack.
So to be back 50 years later with my dad is kind of special.
Tricolor is going to be waved by Brad Pitt. We are racing the 84th running of the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The Ford GT, the Ferrari, battling it out.
We had the problem at the start with the car. We're going a couple laps down right now.
And the number 82 Ferrari, Matteo Monicelli, is going to lose the lead.
Oh, that's the racing competition going out, Ferrari. That gives Ford the upper hand.
The reason the car was created was to win this race. 50 years later, after the infamous 1-2-3, and we did it.